So this is the State of Nevada Department of Health and Human Services Division of Child and Family Services, or DCFS, Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA, pre-application webinar. I'm Julie Blindsmith, the Social Service Program Specialist with the Victim Services section of the Grants Management Unit. With me, I have Jean Booth, and I'll let her introduce herself briefly. Jean, can you talk?
If I could figure out the mute button, this would be very helpful. Hi, this is Jean. I've been with DCFS for almost 3 years and mostly working on VOCA. I'm really excited about this new year that we're headed into, and I'm really happy that so many people have joined us today. Hopefully you guys will learn a lot of information, and we will talk later. Enjoy the training. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Jean. So today we'll be discussing a variety of topics related to the Victims of Crime Act grant. This webinar, this is the third time it's presented this week live, and it was recorded. We're going to try to get it posted to the internet, but we're not sure if that will be a quick process or a long process. You must have at least one person from your agency attend at least one of the webinars to be eligible to apply for the VOCA grant funding. And we're tracking that attendance through the chat box. So to ensure that your attendance is accurately recorded, please type your name and agency that you are representing in the chat box. If you don't type your name and agency into the chat box, you will not get credit for attendees, even if your name shows up on the list of attendees, because we use the chat box to track that. Everybody is muted to reduce the background sound. Please continue to keep yourself on mute so everybody can hear the presentation. If you want to ask a question, please use the chat box. We have a spot for questions at the end, and we will try to get through as many questions as possible. If we do not get through all your questions during the webinar, we will follow up with you next week, and it will also be posted on the frequently asked questions document that we will post to the GMU website on February 3rd. So with all that, let's get into the agenda for this training. We'll go over what is VOCA, the eligibility requirements for subrecipients, allowable and unallowable costs, application materials, and the applying process. And we're going to go over this in the most detail because there's been a lot of changes to how you apply this year. And then we'll go over the scope of work in detail, the budget narrative in detail, timeline, and then we'll briefly touch on award notifications, requests for reimbursement, and compliance. So to start, what is VOCA? The Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA, was passed by Congress in 1984. The Crime Victims Fund was established and is generated from fines and penalties paid by convicted federal offenders. And so it does not use any tax dollars. So VOCA comes from that Crime Victims Fund. And that's why all the rules are set the way they are by Congress. So the Crime Victims Fund is distributed by the Office of Victims of Crime, or OVC, to the Department of Justice, or DOJ. We have acronyms for every agency. The VOCA Assistance Program funding is available for states to fund and facilitate the development of programs that provide direct services to victims of crime. So it doesn't pay for preventative services or some of those other things. It only provides for programs that provide direct services to victims of crime. And we'll get a little more into that. So VOCA in Nevada. The goal of VOCA in Nevada is to promote and support quality victim assistance services programs throughout Nevada. The role of DCFS in that is we are the state administrating agency, so we administer those funds to subrecipients in Nevada, and we're responsible for ensuring that all the subrecipients meet eligibility and organizational requirements, that federal and state quality and compliance standards are met and followed, and we track and report on the standards and programs, and we make sure funding rules and regulations are followed. In Nevada, we have chosen to continue VOCA funding based on the following geographic distribution percentages: 65% to Clark County, 25% to Washoe County, and 10% to the rural counties. This geographic distribution allows for direct services for victims to be provided in both urban areas, with larger populations and allows funding to also be made available for victims in smaller communities in the rural areas. The federal mandate for VOCA requires Nevada to allocate at least 10% of each year's VOCA grant to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and underserved populations. VOCA funding priority is given to programs that serve these populations, and so sexual assault programs should provide assistance to victims in dealing with the trauma of sexual assault and its emotional aftermath. Services may include 24-hour crisis hotlines, crisis intervention, emergency services, legal advocacy, clinical evaluation, and long and short-term counseling. Services may be provided to the victim's family and significant other. Services can be designed to serve both male and female victims, and services may be provided to adult survivors of child sexual abuse or incest. For the domestic violence category, services are to victims and their children, and they include 24-hour hotlines, in crisis intervention, emergency services, shelter or safe homes, long or short-term counseling, information and referral, legal advocacy in obtaining emergency restraining orders, injunctive or other protective orders. And for child abuse, these services should include treatment for children who are victims of physical or sexual abuse and they're not offending parents and siblings. Examples of services may include play, individual or group therapy. Services may be provided through mental health or hospital-based programs. And we'll talk more about the underserved population on the next slide. So because we have to meet these percentages, on the application this year, you'll see that there's a spot where you have to designate how much of your program's funding goes to each of these areas. Please do not put 100% for each of the areas. The percentages you put need to total 100%. And we understand that sometimes these categories overlap, so it's a little bit difficult, but try to do your best estimate of how much of your program funding is spent on these different categories. Nevada's underserved population. So in Nevada, we've decided that the underserved population is children and minors, immigrants, elderly, people with disabilities, LGBTQIA2+, tribal communities, and homeless. This current allocation is based on findings from the 2017 needs assessment, and so that's how we came on those funding priorities. Additionally, the grant has money set aside for innovation. And a lot of people might ask, what is innovation? So the Office of Victims of Crime defines innovation as having one or more of the following things on this list. So based on research, incorporates technology to improve access or efficiency, uses new resources or techniques, can be replicated, increases efficiency, productivity, or quality, enhances services, reduces costs, improves consumer satisfaction, borrowed from another field and adapted to meet the needs of victims, or reaches a new population. So $1 million of the $18 million we're going to award is set aside for innovative funding. And we've identified some priority funding areas in that innovation, and that's children as secondary victims of domestic violence, military sexual trauma, service delivery innovations for sexual assault victims in rural counties, homelessness-related victim services excluding shelter, and human trafficking, and Native American tribes and organizations. So if you're thinking about doing an innovative program, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of resources. In May of 2013, the U.S. Department of Justice, or the DOJ, published a report entitled Vision 21, Transforming Victim Services. And the report can be found online. If you want the link to read it, you can email one of us and we can send it to you. You can just Google search Vision 21, Transforming Victim Services, and it will come up. But it provides information on the history of victim services in the United States and details the challenges and innovative practices that have been successful in improving victim services. The report also contained information on the OJP's website, www.crimesolutions.gov, which disseminates evidence-based practices that can be adapted for use by state or local practitioners. So it has thousands of programs that have been run and tested, and shows whether they're a really good program or a promising program or not successful program. And so you can look at those promising or really successful programs, and it has all the materials, and you can adapt that for Nevada if that's something you're interested in. Not all innovative grants are expected to do that, but that's something that's out there if you want help figuring out how to be innovative. Eligible subrecipients. So we're going to switch gears and talk about who's eligible to apply for the Victims of Crime grant. Agencies that are providing direct services to victims, that promote community efforts to aid crime victims, that promote victim safety. You also have to comply with the civil rights regulations, maintain confidentiality as required by law. You have to have a DUNS number and be registered with www.sam.gov. And if you don't know how to do either of those, there's more information on that in the Notice of Funding Opportunity or NOFO. And if you still have trouble, you can reach out to us and we can provide you more instructions on how to get a DUNS number or register with sam.gov. You also need to help victims apply for the Victims of Crime Compensation Program. Not all victims will qualify for this, but you do need to inform victims that they might qualify and help those that are interested in applying. You also need to utilize volunteers. If for some reason your program cannot have volunteers, you need to let the DMU know, and we can issue you a waiver if there's some legitimate reason why you guys can't use volunteers, but most agencies are expected to use volunteers. And you cannot charge for victims for the VOCA funded services, so you can't have a fee associated with any of your VOCA funded services. Some more eligibility requirements. You must meet program match requirements. So eligible subrecipients must provide a 20% match unless they're a federally recognized tribe or tribal organization operating on tribal land. Everybody else needs to have a 20% match. And Jean will talk more about match when she goes over the budget narrative for us. And then eligible subrecipients provide direct services to victims of crime, demonstrate effectiveness of serving victims in the community. And organizations can be public or private nonprofit organizations or a combination of such organizations. You have to have a meaningful access to those with limited English proficiency. And there's some information on that if you want more info on that at www.let.gov. And at least 25% of the program's funding in the year or in the previous year, if you don't have your funding for the current year, needs to come from other sources other than VOCA. VOCA cannot be your only funding source. So cultural competency. Cultural competency is very important to take into account for agencies administering VOCA funds. Victims of crime can come from diverse geographic, ethnic, racial, cultural, economical, social, linguistic backgrounds, other types. I mean, everybody's different. In order to adequately serve all victims of crime, it is important to address potential cultural barriers, stereotyping, value differences, communication styles, and language and interpreter bias within an organization in order to properly train and prepare victim advocates to provide effective service delivery and ensure the needs of victims are met. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the usage of VOCA funds. So they're available to subrecipients to provide direct services. And subrecipients must provide services to victims of federal and state crimes on the same basis. You can't provide different services based on what level of crime it was. So there are several slides here on allowable costs. I'm not going to read them all to you. If you would like a copy of the slides, please email Jean Booth, and her contact information will be at the end of this presentation, and we'll be more than happy to send it to you. But the list of allowable costs can also be found in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is it's one of the appendices, and it has all the same information, and it just, then you don't have to listen to me read 3 pages of allowable costs. But I recommend that you look at it. If you're adding, if you're a new applicant to VOCA, or if you're adding a new service to your VOCA program, to make sure that it's something that is allowed under VOCA. So here's the second page. Give you guys a few minutes to scan that. All right, here's the third page. This is administrative costs. So VOCA does consider some administrative costs related to direct services. So some grants consider direct services only those that are paid for on the client, but VOCA will pay for personnel costs for those personnel that are working directly with victims of crime. It will pay for skills training for staff and training-related travel, organizational expenses, equipment and furniture, operating costs. And so this list is helpful when you're putting together your budget. Allowable costs, another one. This just gives you some more from the CFR that are allowable. And then there's a slide especially for those who are providing emergency shelter with the rules around that. And then one for direct service for personnel for advocacy and emotional support. Most of those things are covered. Just to note, if you are going to provide number 7, traditional, cultural, or alternative therapy or healing, that needs to have proven documentation of benefits to the victim recovery. You can't just say, I think this would be good. There needs to be some kind of evidence in documentation that that traditional or that type of service is effective to help victims. Here's a slide on if you're doing restorative justice and what's covered under restorative justice. And here are unallowable costs. You also should review this. This is in the Notice of Funding Opportunity also. And you want to make sure these things are not in your budget, because we will not be able to pay them, and that will automatically reduce the amount of funding that we'll consider funding you for. No, we can't pay for lobbying under VOCA, research or studies, active investigation and prosecution of criminal activities, and that's except for the provision of victim assistance services, so emotional support for victims, advocacy, legal services to help the victim go through that process, but not funding to help the prosecution prosecute that criminal. Fundraising is not allowed, so if you're doing an outreach event, you really need to be clear on whether it's an outreach event or a fundraising event, because VOCA cannot pay for fundraising events. Capital expenses, compensation to victims of crime, so we cannot have programs that are going to directly give cash to victims. You can give out bus passes or food vouchers, those things, but you cannot give direct money to victims of crime under VOCA. VOCA will not pay for medical care, and it does not pay for the salary and expenses of management other than under indirect costs. So Jean will talk more about this in detail when we go over the budget narrative form and the personnel costs. So the application, we're going to switch gears and talk about the application. It's a bit different this year. We're going to go over each of these in detail, but the application consists of an application checklist and then sections 1 through 7 and the application guide. So the application checklist does not need to be submitted to us. It's a tool to assist you, and I'm going to pull it up. It is on the application form, and it's the first few pages, and you'll see it helps walk you through what each section requires, and additionally what attachments you will need to include with the email. The application this year is going to consist of two parts, an online application and then emailing of those things that cannot be submitted to the online portal, because the online application right now does not accept signatures and does not accept tables and graphics. So it'll be a process of a web application and then the additional items. So this checklist is here. It got sent out with the notice of funding opportunity, and it's posted on the GMU website. If you would like Word versions of this or the application guide, which I will show you in a minute also, just email Jean Booth or myself, and we can send it to you. So the application form is right after that checklist, and it's one document. It's very short, and it's not worth any points, but you have to complete it. And then it has the scope of work table after it, and the proposed project budget after that. And those are both worth points. And then once it's completed, you're going to email it as a PDF to the DCFS grants at dcfs.nv.gov. So let me pull that checklist back up. So after the checklist, you'll see the application form. It's very short. You'll write your organization name, your key personnel. You can add more rows if you have more key personnel than that. Funding. Here you want to make sure you put all your funding so that we can see that you have at least 25% of funding from other sources and meet that CFR definition. And then it has a spot for your signature. That's the application form. It's really short. But then there's the scope of work table, which we'll go over in a little bit more detail. And then just your budget summary, budget proposal. This is a little different this year because we are not requiring that you turn in multiple applications if you want traditional and innovative funding. We only want one application per agency, and we want you to describe in the narrative section what you're going to do in your traditional award and what you're going to do in your innovative award if you're doing both. And here you would put what you're requesting in amount for your traditional, what you're requesting for your innovative, and then the total. If you're just requesting traditional, you just put this here and then zeros, and then the total would just be the traditional. If you're only requesting innovative, the traditional would be 0, and your innovative would be filled with numbers that match the total. So this is a little different just to help people not have to submit multiple applications. And then you'll do your budget narrative, and your budget narrative, it'll just be one budget narrative form, regardless if you're requesting traditional and innovative or just one or the other. You'll just do one budget narrative. All right, back to the slides. So the application sections 2, 3, and 6 are all on the online form. So I'm going to show you what the online form is, but it will be the proposal summary, proposal narrative, and the agency self-assessment. So this is what the online form looks like. You can access it from any web browser. There are items that are required and some that are not. The ones that are not are usually those that are not going to apply to all agencies or that are related to innovative. If you are applying for innovative funding, please make sure you complete all the innovative questions. Even though the form will let you submit it without finishing all of those, you will lose points if you do not have those filled out. So it just takes extra time. We do have, and I'm going to show you this before I finish showing you the form. We do have an application guide. And the application guide has every question that the online portal has, so that you can prepare that information and then just copy and paste it into the online form so that you're all ready to go, so that you don't have to be on the web and then writing these things and trying to review them. This application guide is posted in a fillable PDF on our website, but again, if you would like to get a Word document, please email us. We're not allowed to post Word documents on our website, but this is available for you if you would like it. So let me go back to the online. So you'll see you fill that out and you keep going down. This is just basic information. Here's the part 1 through 4. These are the ones that, and 5 other, 1 through 5 needs to total up to 100%. So make sure that you're not putting 100% for each of those. And the instructions does say that, but I just want to reiterate it because most years we get a lot that do not add up to 100%. So wanted to highlight that. And then you fill out the rest of this. And see, this isn't required because not everybody has subcontractors, but if you are subcontracting your services, please make sure to fill in the subcontracting section. And then it goes into the narrative and you can cut and paste in here and it will hold that 1,000 words. So about 2 pages maximum of typing. And you'll see the innovative ones are not required. And then this goes into section E, the self-assessment, and finish all the way down. And once you're done with all of them, you can hit submit, and you will get an automated email letting you know that your application was received. If you missed the section that was required, you'll get this. This is there are some errors on your form. Please correct the errors labeled in red on your form and try submitting again. So you close that and you'll see everything. I didn't fill out anything, so it's popping a bunch of errors. There isn't a way to save your progress and come back to this. However, I did test it out and I left the browser open with stuff in it for well over a week and it didn't delete it and it still let me submit. So there is that option, but I would really use the guide if I was you and then just fill it all out in one go. That is the online form. We're hoping that eventually next year, everything will be online and you won't have that dual process of sending us the application form, the scope of work, and the budget narrative. We're hoping that everything will be able to be submitted online. So scope of work is another spot that people have a lot of questions and a lot of trouble on the notice of funding opportunities on the application. So we wanted to take some time to go over that. So in the narrative, you have the goals and objectives section, and that section should match pretty closely to the scope of work table that you're going to provide. So if they, for some reason, were separated and your agency name wasn't on it, people would be able to know that that table belongs to that narrative section. They should kind of follow together. And then the other thing people get confused by is what's a goal, what's an objective, what's an activity. So a goal is a broad statement about what the program or innovative intends to accomplish. So you can have a scope of work table with multiple goals. If you are doing a traditional and innovative program, you should have at least one goal for each program and a table for each so that it's kind of clear what each program is doing. But for example, if you're doing a domestic violence shelter, your goal could be to provide shelter and supportive services to victims of domestic violence. Then your objective, you want to write these objectives as SMART objectives, and we'll go over what that means in a few slides. But what is to be derived from that goal? And it needs to be measurable, like it has to have a number in it so it's clear whether or not you achieved it or not. And then activities are those efforts conducted to help you achieve those objectives. So, scope of work goals should match the other sections of your narrative. So it shouldn't be some goal on there that you've never talked about in any of your narratives that comes out of anywhere. And it should match your budget too. If you're talking about a program that's going to provide legal advocacy to victims of crime, and then your goals have information about gas vouchers and childcare, and you never mention in your narrative that that's necessary for the legal advocacy to help the victims get to court or to be able to meet without having to worry about their children. It shouldn't come out of nowhere. All of that should be described somewhere in your narrative that matches with your scope of work. They should really connect, and with your budget. And goals should start with an action word. So provide, increase, improve are all great ones. I'm sure you can think of more action words to start your goals with, but it should really be an action, that goal. And it should state the target population. Are you targeting domestic violence victims, all victims of crime? Are you targeting a specific underserved population? Who is this goal and targeting? So when you get to the objectives, you want to make sure that they're SMART or specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So specific means that they're not vague. You know exactly what that objective is saying. Measurable means it's going to have a number so we know whether or not you met it or not. Achievable means you don't ever want to say you're going to reach 100% of the victims or do 100%. It's got to be something that you could accomplish. Relevant means it should be connected to the rest of your narrative and program, and it should be related to the goal you wrote. And time bound, you don't have to worry about as much because our scope of work goal or table, which I'll show you here, has the goal up top, and then the objectives, activities, and then it has a due date. So you don't need to write your dates in your objectives because you have a column that will collect that. But you really want to think about that. A lot of times people just put the end of the award, but if you have an objective of hiring an advocate to help with something, you don't want the goal of that to be the end of the award, because you don't hire that person until the end of the award. They're not going to get much work done during the award period. So really look at your objectives and think, when is your goal date to get that done? Some things, like if you're doing a domestic violence shelter and you want to provide 2,000 fed nights shelter, that would be throughout the program. It might be appropriate to put the end of the award period as the due date. And then you're going to want to think about how you're documenting those things and where you're going to look to see for reporting on that. And then in the last column, how will you measure that? How will you be reporting on that? How will you be measuring that? We get a lot of people who write scope of work objectives, and then when it comes time to do their program reports, which is we pull them directly from here, it's very hard for them to measure that, and it becomes a lot of paperwork and a lot of tracking. So you want to think about that before you write it in, so that whoever's in charge of doing your program report doesn't want to pull their hair out, that it's something that is measurable without having to take all your staff time. And then I'm going to hand it over to Jean, who's going to talk to you about the budget narrative and the budget narrative form. Now, that was emailed out to all those who got the email. If you didn't get the email on the notice of funding opportunity, you could email Jean or myself, and we'll send you the Excel form for the budget narrative. Go ahead, Jean.
Thank you, Julie. So budget narrative is in three parts. It's got three tabs: budget narrative, budget summary, and match budget narrative. We're going to talk about the main budget narrative to begin with in quite a bit of detail, just to make sure everybody understands what each category stands for. So the first category is the personnel. The employees who provide direct services should be identified here. The NOFO has a table to help you distinguish if an employee is an employee or a contract staff. And we'll go into that a little bit more detail when we go through contractors. The employees are basically anybody who is paid by your organization. You're going to want to make sure that you put the name of the employee, their position title, and a description of what they do for that particular position. If you want to try to get reimbursed for your executive salaries in this section, that's fine, but they do have to provide direct services to clients. It's not supervisory or training services, it's actual services to the victims. So you would have to put justification and details of those duties that they perform for actual victim service. I'm drawing a blank today. Victim service duties. So if you can make sure that you have that justification, you're very welcome to put the executive staff in there. You just have to really explain why they provide and how they provide that direct service to clients. Only those staff whose time can be traced directly back to the grant project should be included in this budget category. All other staff should be considered part of your indirect costs, and we'll go over that in a little bit. Next slide, Julie. So this is an example of what the personnel section looks like. If you need to add or delete rows on this, that's completely fine. Just make sure you keep all the information that we need to have on this for the employees. And if you want to get reimbursed for their fringe information, you're going to want to figure out what that totals out to and put that in this form as well, so that way you can get reimbursed for their fringe and their gross wage. Go ahead, next. So travel training, these costs must provide direct benefits to the project you're applying for. You're going to identify the staff who's going to be traveling under the justification section. The purpose of that trip or the conference or training that you're going to be going to, and the projected cost of that. All the cost of that information is going to be right above the justification line, and you're going to make sure that you just explain why you need to go to this training and who is going to this training, and it has to kind of correlate with what VOCA covers. So it has to correlate with victim services. So it can't be a training on like how to better fund your organization. It has to be some sort of training on how to better serve clients who have been victimized. Any travel and training cannot exceed the US GSA rates, and they have to be associated with the project. If you're going to do mileage and take clients to appointments or food bank or anything of that nature, that would be fine too. You'd want to put that in the mileage section of this category, and do your best estimate on what you think that's going to cost you in the next year. We can always work on this with you if and when you get funded, but make sure that your mileage is put in there so that your staff can be reimbursed for that information. And mileage consists of anything from office to another place with your client. It does not include your staff's miles from their home to work. That's going to be normal commute time, and that doesn't get included in with mileage reimbursement. Next slide, Julie. So this is what that travel training section looks like, and you can see where the justification sections are. So that's where you're going to put in all the information about the trainings that you're going to be going to, or the mileage that you need reimbursed for. If you're going to just do mileage, your justification would be just to transport clients in need. It's just simplified. Okay, next tab. So the operating section, these are costs associated with the operation of providing direct services to the victim. So basically, this is your rent, your utilities, your office supplies, your program supplies, your general supplies for the organization. They don't necessarily all correlate to 100% of victim services. So these are all going to be costs allocated for VOCA and for throughout the entire funding that you have for this particular program that you're going to be working for. You don't need to specify each individual office supply, so you don't need to label out staples, pens, pencils, etc. It's just office supplies. But we do want to kind of get a general idea of what you're asking for with this. So I would make sure that it's clear, and if you think that you need to add a little bit of justification for any of these items, please go ahead and put it at the bottom of this category. Go ahead next, Julie. So this is an example of the operating section. The items in this section are just suggested items that VOCA will pay for as far as operating costs. You can add or delete line items as needed. You can kind of move line items around if you need to. Just keep in mind that any operating costs associated with your organization should be included in this section. Next slide. Okay, equipment has been a little bit confusing for our subrecipients this year, which is totally understandable. Equipment needs to be any item that is $5,000 or more, or any electronics. So what that means is if you're running a shelter and you find out that you need to replace all your beds, the equipment that you'd need to put into this line item would be any bed that costs over $5,000, or dresser, or desk, or chair, etc. Any furniture item that individually costs $5,000 or more. If you're buying beds for the whole organization, then each individual bed, I'm hoping, is not going to be $5,000, but it may cost over $5,000 for the bunch. That can go in your other costs because the cost of each individual item is less than the $5,000. As far as the electronics, regardless of cost, they need to go into the equipment budget. That means computers, tablets, iPads, or cell phones all need to go into the equipment category. Equipment that does not directly facilitate the purpose of the project as an integral component is not allowed. And the equipment must be purchased for this project, and it must be labeled, inventoried, and tracked as such. So if you do get awarded, we'll go over a lot more detail on what needs to happen with your equipment as far as our regulations and VOCA regulations are concerned. But what you need to know for the NOFO purposes is all equipment, including computers, need to be in the equipment section. Go ahead next. And this is what your equipment section looks like. Okay, next. So your contractual consultant services, these are project workers who are not employees of your organization. What that means is if you have a staff member that's working with you and you pay all their wages, their benefits, their time off, etc., those would be employees. Contracts, consultants and contractual staff, they should have either a 1099 with you or a contract with you stating what their services they're going to provide and how much you pay them, either hourly or monthly or yearly, whatever your contract specifies. You're not going to be paying their benefits or any of that extra stuff because they're contracted with you and they are supposed to cover all of that information. So that's what makes them different than an employee. So anybody who falls under that, those guidelines need to be considered under contractual. What I want you guys to keep in mind when you are filling out this section is if the contractor is a sole source or competitive bid, we do need to have documentation and justification of why you picked this individual or group or company. If it's sole source, this is a pretty rare thing. Sole source basically means this is a person or an organization that only does this particular service, and they're the only one that does that service throughout the entire state. Nobody else can provide this service for you. So if that is the case, you need to explain that on your budget narrative. If that is not the case, which is most contracts, that's a competitive bid. So if and when you get funded, you're going to have to provide a copy of 3 quotes that you've reached out to 3 different organizations for the services that you picked to provide. And then you're going to have to provide justification and the proof of the contract, the confidentiality form, and any applicable license to our staff. So that's if and when you get funded. That isn't part of the NOFO process. I just want to keep that in the back of your mind when you are going to actually use the contract section, so that you know that there's a lot more work involved than just handing us one particular contract. Next, Julie. So this is what the contract section looks like, and you can see where the method of selection says sole source or competitive bid. You're going to let us know what that looks like on your budget narrative. You're going to define what their duties are going to be, and then you're going to kind of justify and explain what is going on with this particular contractor. Next. So the other section is a little bit interchangeable with the operating section. It can include things as audit costs, car insurance, client transportation. What I mean by that is if you're going to provide gas cards or bus passes for the clients, that would be accessible. Any emergency client services would be put in this section, or anything that you just can't figure out where it needs to go should go into this section. If you're just having a real rough time at trying to figure out where a cost needs to go, I would put it in here, and if you get funded, we'll address that question at that time and see if maybe we can fit that in a better category. Next. This is what your other expenses category looks like. You can add or delete rows as you need. We do want to try to encourage everybody to keep information in this category that is associated with your program and client fees. We're trying really hard to make sure that services for clients and services for your operating costs remain separate. So I'm trying to get this particular category merged over to be mostly client services category. So anything that you need for operating your organization should be in the operating expense, and everything else should be in the other expense. Next slide. So indirect costs, these are a little frustrating for some people. These represent the expenses of doing businesses that are not readily identified or allocable to a specific grant, contract, project, function, or activity, but are necessary for your operation. So these would be all your administrative people, like your receptionist, your executive director, your bookkeeper, things of that nature. They don't necessarily provide direct services, but they're needed for your organization. So you're allowed to have up to a 10% de minimis with VOCA for an indirect rate. Unless you have a current federally approved indirect cost rate, then you would provide that indirect agreement with your application and put in what that percentage looks like on your budget narrative. You'll definitely have to identify your indirect expenses. We want to know what you're charging towards indirect. If and when you get funded, you're not going to have to prove that indirect cost unless we ask for it. But you do have to identify it on your bookkeeping expenses and make sure that it is allocated appropriately. Next slide. So this is what your indirect cost category looks like. On the first line, you can see where it says that you need to identify the indirect expenses. Go ahead and put the total amount of indirect costs on those lines, and the purple section will automatically calculate that of 10%. Okay, next. So your budget narrative form 2, this is your budget summary. The column B should automatically update with the totals from the first form that we just went over. If it doesn't, then let us know, because there's a problem with the form, but it should all automatically calculate with the total, and the total expenses will be what you're requesting for of this of VOCA to pay for this particular program. Sections C through G, those are for your other funding. You're going to want to make sure that you put the information of the other funding in for this particular program. We know that there's a lot of organizations that have a lot of different programs that they work under. We work with a lot of counties and universities, so we know that there's a lot of other things that your agency provides. So we don't want the total agency budget, we just want the budget for this particular project and program. But we do need to see that you're getting other funding, and this other funding can be in-kind donations, volunteers, private donations, private grants, state grants, federal grants, anything else that you're getting other than VOCA is where you're going to want to put this here. Make sure you fill this out to the best of your ability, because we do need to see a full snapshot of what funding sources and what your agency is getting for this project. Next slide, Julie. Okay, so this is what the budget summary looks like. So you can see the middle section doesn't have any dollar signs in it. That's the section that you're going to fill out with your other funding sources. You're going to want to make sure that you're filling it out as completely as possible because we do need to see a snapshot of what that looks like. Next slide. So we don't have an example of what this form looks like in the slides, but it's basically the exact same as the first tab that we just went over, the budget narrative. It's the match budget narrative. Match is 20% of the total award. What that means is match is 20% of what you're requesting for VOCA plus match. So to calculate what that amount looks like, you take the amount you're asking for, you divide it by 80%, and then multiply it by 20%. And that's what your total match should look like for this award period. All funds designated to match are restricted to the same uses as the subaward funds. So anything that VOCA allows, you should be able to match with your match funds. And it must be expended within the grant period. Match can be any non-federal funding, donations, or volunteers. So that's in-kind donations, private donations, fundraising monies that you receive. Volunteers is the easiest since VOCA does require that you do have volunteer services. And anything that basically can assist with your project that is not federally funded. Next, I think that's it for me. Yes, that's it for me. I'm going to go ahead and transfer it back over to Julie. Thank you.
So I'm just going to talk about a few last little things, and then we will have time for questions. So I wanted to briefly go over the award notification timeline. So the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or the NOFA, was announced on January 15th, and we will be posting questions and answers from all of these 3 webinars and any email or phone call questions that we get between now and the end of January on our website, hopefully by February 3rd. And then the deadline for submission is February 12th, 2021 at 5 p.m. And this is really important. That online form will turn off and not be available to submit anymore after 5 p.m. So really don't wait to the last minute. Try to do it early so that you don't have to worry about if it says you're missing the field and you're trying to hurry and get it submitted before the end of the time. Do it early since it's a new process. Give yourself time. Don't stress yourself out. My recommendation. Then the evaluation period will start the following week, and it'll be February 15th through March 5th for the evaluation committee to review those applications and meet and discuss them. And then the announcement of the awards should be around mid-March, hopefully. And the performance period will be July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022. So once the review committee meets to review all the VOCA applications and they're scored, the funding decisions are made, and then we will send out the notice to intend to fund. And that's when, if you're not funded at 100%, we'll begin negotiating with you and working on getting revised budgets and scope of work. Once those are approved, then the DCFS will draft a NOSA, or Notice of Subaward, and it is fully executed when it's signed by both parties and once the DCFS administration has signed it. Once that's done, we will send out the executed NOSA with the grant instructions and requirements, or GERS, for that year, and the request for reimbursement, or RFR workbooks, and the quarterly reporting workbook. So you'll get all of that in one email. And then people can bill from July 1st, 2021, but if your NOSA is not fully executed, you can't bill until your Notice of Subaward is fully executed. So if it takes a bit longer to complete that, the first RFR is due by August 15th, but if you don't have a executed NOSA by then, you cannot bill until that is executed. That's all I really wanted to say on that. We will have, after we issue all the NOSAs, and once we are working on those, the intents to funds have gone out, we will have mandatory trainings, and we'll let you all know about that. So everybody who's funded will be required to do mandatory trainings. One of those will be on the request for reimbursement. And all costs charged to the VOCA award must be reasonable, allowable, and allocatable. The DOJ grants financial guide defines reasonable as those costs that a prudent person would have incurred under circumstances prevailing at the time of the decision to incur the cost was made. Just wanted you all to know that and be aware of that when you're developing your budget. That might be helpful. And then when you submit that, you submit the RFR cover letter, your Excel workbook, the backup documentation. But again, we'll have in-depth training on requests for reimbursement for those who are funded. Compliance. So just so everybody's aware of what the requirements will be if you are funded, requests for reimbursements are due the 15th of each month. So like July's request for reimbursement is due by August 15th. August is due by September 15th. We need those even if no costs were incurred for that month. So even if you're not billing anything for that month, you still need one that says $0. Performance reports, those quarterly reports, are due the 15th of each quarter. So October 15th, January 15th, April 15th, and July 15th. Those are dates are in the notice of funding opportunity, but you should be aware of those. We also will have on-site monitoring. We do routine on-site monitoring to make sure that we're providing technical support and that all subrecipients are following state and federal laws. Those on-site monitorings are made to make sure that we're helping subrecipients meet the standards that are required by the VOCA program. They're not meant to be punitive, and we kind of rotate to make sure that no one's gone too long without one. And then we will have regular communication. If there's any changes to federal or state laws that are things that you'll have to follow. You'll also have to do the federal civil rights training and the form that says that someone at your agency has completed that. And you'll have to register with Nevada 211. All right, that was all that we had prepared. So we'll go to questions, but I'm not going to leave the question slide up. I'm going to go to the next slide with our contact information because looking at the word questions is not useful to people. But we'll go ahead and answer any questions. I think there's been some in the chat box.
Yeah, Julie, we had a couple questions today. The first one was, do you anticipate offering match waivers for this funding opportunity? Yes, but they will be available after the NOFO. We really want to encourage all agencies applying to do their very best to try to meet the 20% match requirement. But we do understand that with today's climate, match can be a little bit difficult to obtain. So we will offer it, but it won't be until after funding decisions have been made. Did you want to add anything to that, Julie?
Nope, I think that was a great answer.
Excellent. And then the next question was, will these slides be available after the webinar? Yes, please go ahead and email myself, Jean, for a PDF copy of this training at jbooth@dcfs.nv.gov. My information's on the screen right now. Is equipment allowable if not for directors or administrators? Yes, it is allowable for any staff involved in victim services, even indirectly. Do you want to add anything to that, Julie?
Nope. Thank you for your good answer.
And then, does the contract section include outsourced counselors? If yes, each year we need to secure 3 bids for counseling, or if we have an established counselor, is it okay to stick with them? So from what my understanding is of this question, is contractors are anyone who have a contract with you that has a rate of service. So if you have a contract with this outsourced contractor or counselor, then yes, he would be considered, or she or whoever would be considered a contractor. If the outsourced counselor falls under that guide, yes, you would have to provide the 3 quotes, and yes, he would be considered a contractor. It would be fine to stick with them, but you do need additional quotes for counseling your justification with staying with the counselor that you're currently with would be that you have a history of service with that particular counselor. But 3 quotes are required each funding year with VOCA. And that was all the questions we had today. If anybody else has any more questions. Oh, you want to add one?
A little bit more.
Perfect.
I would, if you are outsourcing employees on a regular basis, I would make sure that your agency has a policy on that, and that you are looking at the rate of pay every so many years in your policies and procedures. Perhaps that's 5 years, perhaps that's 3, perhaps that's 10. It kind of depends on your agency, but I would write some policies and procedures around that, just to make sure, you know, that you're paying them appropriately. I know that costs go up, not down usually, but just so that you know that it's not like someone is just every year they work for you and every year they get a huge raise as a contractor. But I don't see that usually in our application. Sorry, that was a rambly thing.
You're good. So if anybody else has any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. We'll stay on for a little bit just to make sure that all questions get answered today.
If not, I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their week, and we appreciate you joining.
All right, it doesn't look like we have any other questions coming in, Julie. So if you guys have questions about any of this in the next coming weeks, go ahead and email them to either myself, Julie, or the DCF Grants inbox, and we're happy to answer your questions and put them on our fax. Thank you and have a great day.